screen.
Thank you, Dana. Welcome, everyone. My name is Rachel. Sorry about that. I muted myself. My name is Rachel Heller. I'm the CEO at CHAPA. Thank you so much for joining us today. I also want to start by thanking our sponsor, Bank of America, for supporting these regional meetings, which are truly vital for us to connect with different parts of the state so that we understand how housing challenges are impacting people in different regions across the Commonwealth. And we get a sense of the local efforts that people are doing to address these housing challenges. And then we can also identify ways to work together for solutions. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, Central Mass Housing Alliance, New View Communities, and RCAP Solutions. We are so honored to work with you every day. And just to give a little bit of context about these meetings and about CHAPA, these meetings are really important to our work. CHAPA is a statewide affordable housing organization that encourages the production and preservation of homes that are affordable to households with low and moderate incomes. And we work to foster diverse and sustainable communities through planning and community development. For more than 50 years, we've been working at the local, state, and federal levels. We've been working to expand access to housing through our coordination of the Massachusetts Homeownership Collaborative, monitoring thousands of affordable homes across the state, and administering mass access. And we've also been working to develop the affordable housing field through trainings, forums, Young Professionals Network, and through the mentorship program that we run with the Mel King Institute. So in how we do our work, CHAPA brings together a very broad group of stakeholders, and it represents nonprofit and for-profit developers, housing authorities, tenants, legal services, real estate attorneys, municipal officials, planners, disability advocates, homelessness advocacy organizations, community groups, and more. And we believe that by coming together, we can build a better future for everyone in the Commonwealth. This is something that we've always done in Massachusetts. We've shaped the future that we want for ourselves. And the affordable housing challenges that face our state put us at great risk right now of really losing everything that we hold so true and value about our state. The urgency of the COVID pandemic and racial injustices are demanding that we rethink who we are and who we want to be as a Commonwealth. And the decisions that we make now, and we have so many to make at the state and local levels when it comes to how we'll spend our federal recovery dollars, the different land use decisions we'll make. These decisions will determine our future and can be the difference in ensuring that we provide opportunities for every person to have safe, healthy, affordable homes in the communities of their choice. So I want to thank you for joining today's regional meeting. It's through this meeting and meetings like this that we're doing across the state that we'll get a better understanding of what's happening. And that includes the innovative things that you are already doing and that we'll hear from other areas of the state. These meetings really are going to help tremendously, especially as I said just a moment ago, as we think about these federal dollars, these unprecedented federal ARPA recovery dollars. We also, at the same time as we have this huge influx of federal money, we're also seeing increases in the state budget to affordable housing programs, and we have new state laws around zoning. So today it'll be an exchange. How do we put these things together? We'll share updates on what we're doing and what we're seeing at the state and federal levels, and we want to hear from you. How can we work together to ensure that everyone has a safe, healthy, affordable home in the community they choose? How can we use the new federal recovery funds that are here, that our state and our communities will decide how we use them? How will we use them to ensure that our future is more affordable, more equitable, more accessible, and more sustainable? I now turn it over to Ryan Dominguez, who is CHAPA's resident expert on federal policy, the ARPA funds, and what's happening throughout New England. Ryan, I turn it to you.
All right, thank you, Rachel. And as mentioned, there's billions of dollars that are coming in from the federal government directly to Massachusetts to really help us to address many of the housing issues that we've seen exacerbated over the past year during the pandemic. And I think that these funds can really help us to aid in our recovery as we try to address the housing crisis. So today I'll give you a little bit of a brief overview of some of the funding that is coming in. Just as a reminder, back in March, President Biden signed the American Rescue Plan Act, which you may see referred to as ARPA. And this allocated billions of dollars to Massachusetts, including a number of different resources that can be used for housing. So on the slide that you see up before you is the first bucket of funding, and this is called the Fiscal Recovery Funds. So Massachusetts is eligible to receive $5.3 billion in fiscal recovery funds, while cities and towns and counties can receive up to $3.4 billion directly. So in total, we have $8.7 billion coming to Massachusetts. And these funds can be used to support everything from public health resources, lost revenue, infrastructure investments, and of course, housing. You may have seen that the governor came out with a plan for these funds, which includes around $1 billion for housing, and $500 million of that was going to go to home ownership, while another $500 million was going to go to rental housing production. So we're going to support all of Governor Baker's requests for that type of funding for housing, but I think we also have the opportunity to ask for a little bit more, as well as to expand that funding into other programs. So some of your local cities, towns, or counties will receive money directly for fiscal recovery funds, and you'll see this on the next slide. So you'll see that, places like Fitchburg have received 23 million, Leominster has received around 11 million, and Worcester has received 110 million, and then the county as a whole will receive around $161 million. If you don't see your city or town up on this list, then they probably are within this non-entitlement communities bucket, and that money will be going directly to the state, and then they will dole it out to each of your cities and towns. So then, in terms of eligible uses for the fiscal recovery funds, you can advocate for your city or town to use the funding from fiscal recovery for rent, mortgage, or utility assistance. You can use it for counseling or legal aid to help to prevent evictions. You can create affordable housing and promote development in qualified census tracts, as well as for populations and in areas and communities that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, as well as services to provide supportive housing to people who are experiencing homelessness. So throughout this slide deck, I put in the U.S. Treasury guidance for all of the federal funds that I'll be talking about today. And in each of those, they detail and provide information about what you can actually use these funds for. And I would recommend that you review each of these documents as you consider advocacy on the local level. So then moving on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about some of the other funds that are coming in. The first one are the emergency housing vouchers, which are basically Section 8 vouchers for those who are experiencing homelessness, those experiencing domestic violence or housing instability. And specifically, the state has received around 1,700 emergency housing vouchers, and 917 of those have gone to DHCD, and 73 have gone to Worcester County. You also see here that we have homelessness assistance through HOME, and HOME is a federal program that will allow us to create more housing and provide supportive services for those who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness. Again, non-entitlement communities will receive around $36 million in HOME. But Worcester specifically has received close to $6 million for HOME, which they can use to build more housing or provide supportive services. And then there's the Homeowners Assistance Fund, which will help to pay for mortgages and utility costs that will help to keep low-income homeowners in their homes. And we're eligible to receive around $178 million for the Homeowners Assistance Fund. And then finally, on the next slide, you'll see that we received the biggest tranche of money, which is emergency rental assistance. And we've received around $819 million in total rental assistance, which can be used up to 18 months for rental arrears and also overdue utility costs. You will see I provided a few links in there on how to access rental assistance from your local housing authority. And so please share this information with anybody who may be needing emergency rental assistance at this time. And then finally, on the next page, you'll see that the state created a resource page for anybody to be able to get information about all of the federal funding that is coming into the state and how to access some of the state resources that we've created off of that federal funding. So you'll see links to things like Right to Counsel, some of the state-run emergency rental programs, including SHIRA and IRMA, and just a general resource for how to access and apply for some of these resources. So I would recommend everybody check out that website. And then for anybody who wants to get involved, you can always contact your local state legislators as well as your local officials to try to get involved in the process and ask them to prioritize housing when they're thinking about using some of these federal funds. And then finally, you can always get involved with some of our local CHAPA committees. We always want to hear from our local advocates so that we can really know what to prioritize in terms of our legislative priorities as well as our budgetary priorities. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Whitney, who can talk a little bit about fair housing.
Thanks so much, Ryan. There is so much for us to be excited about during this time and much for us to do. So thank you for charging folks in that way. I'm excited to talk about our fair housing initiatives here at CHAPA. My name is Whitney Demetrius. Again, I am the Fair Housing Engagement Director here, and I'm excited to really get the opportunity to talk about both our focus at CHAPA, sort of recentering on fair housing, but certainly to center some of our conversation in some of what we're seeing federally as well. And so on the next slide, talk a little bit about the Biden administration's sort of building back better in fair housing. I'll talk about three things in terms of the redressing discriminatory housing practices, sex discrimination, and affirmatively furthering fair housing. So some exciting things to share. And so back in January this year, the Biden administration sort of issued a memo and sort of really centered it around redressing the nation's history, discriminatory housing practices and policies, and really being intentional about undoing those things and making sure that all of the HUD policies at the Department of Housing and Urban Development were in line with the Fair Housing Act. So that was really great to see at the start of this administration, the start of this year. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about what happened just a month later in February. I was really excited to see a HUD memo on sex discrimination, which really identified sex discrimination as a protected class to also include sexual orientation and gender identity. This was really big, specifically because although we have sexual orientation as a protected class here in Massachusetts, this broadened it out federally across the nation. So that was really excited to see. And certainly there are implications with being able to file an actual complaint at HUD, right, at the Department of Housing and Urban Development around sex discrimination under this extended definition and criteria. So that was certainly exciting to see as well. And then lastly, there has been a restoring of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, similar to what was put in place during the Obama administration, and there was an interim final rule that was put into place with a comment period that just ended earlier this month. And the final version will then be effective during the end of this month, July 31st. So I'm sure many of you have seen that and have given comments, and so we're hopeful that that looks better in terms of how it works, its workings, and the feedback that folks have gotten across the country. So excited about that, but certainly taking much of our directive from what we've seen federally to kind of how it plays into our CHAPA Fair Housing legislative priorities. So it's my pleasure to really get the opportunity to share out what our policy team, Ryan, Eric, and Abby have really put together around exclusionary zoning, disparate impact, and of course, affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the next slide, I'll talk just briefly about what each of those things will do. But we, of course, invite you to dive deeper and to help us in our advocacy of these things. So the exclusionary zoning will certainly prohibit restrictive land use zoning and permitting decisions that perpetuate segregation. Our affirmatively furthering for housing would create a statewide duty to affirmatively further for housing, right? We sort of looked again at what California has done and certainly have looked to our friends here in Boston who have worked around affirmatively furthering and linking that to the zoning, but really thinking about what does it mean, right, during the last administration to have that rescinded and to have something in place statewide. And then lastly, the Fair Housing Disparate Impact Standard would create a standard for having policies and practices that, despite the intent, do not work against housing discrimination in the community, right? The standard will protect people against housing discrimination, despite what the intent of the actual practice or policy will be on its face. So excited to put together that legislative agenda around that. And certainly, as I'll share in the next slide, there are some local initiatives that many of you all are working on. And so we want to hear from you as well, because as part of our incentive here at CHAPA, we really want to make sure that we have a sense of what's happening in fair housing on the local level. So certainly across the Commonwealth, there are fair housing commissions and committees and human rights commissions and diversity and equity inclusion offices and other like organizations doing work around fair housing, right, around education and outreach, providing assistance for people who experience discrimination, and promoting open and welcoming communities. So we would love to hear from you all, and certainly we've shared in the chat for folks who might be interested in diving deeper on what fair housing is. We invite you to check out our housing toolbox. And then also, if you're interested in starting one of these sort of incentives, we shared some links for you on how to start a fair housing commission locally or etc. Here at CHAPA, we're also inviting you to our Fair Housing Committee. We have revitalized our Fair Housing Committee. We meet periodically. We have a diverse group of stakeholders, and we certainly want representation in your region, right, and across the state to really be able to work to share information, right, work on legislation together, coordinate our efforts, and educate ourselves. So we invite you to join if you are interested in whichever capacity you're interested in doing that. So lastly, as I said, I've sort of charged you all in what you can do. You can certainly join a local effort, establish or revitalize or even expand local fair housing committees and commissions, et cetera, the work that's happening locally. You can contact your municipal officials and decision makers, state legislators, and certainly join our Fair Housing Committee. So certainly reach out to me. I'll be sure to put my information in the chat. So we certainly want to know what you're working on and how we can be an asset to you all as well. I'll hand it over now to Dana to talk a little bit about Municipal Engagement Initiative, which I'm also a part of, and I'm so excited for the work that we do in that effort, as specifically as it pertains to fair housing as well on the local level. So I'll pass it to you, Dana.
Thank you, Whitney. As I said at the top of this, I'm Dana Lewinter. I am the Director of Municipal Engagement here at CHAPA and work with Whitney and Lily on our team. So just want to give you a little bit of background on what our program is and how you can get involved with us and how we may be able to assist you at the local level. So starting with this, why do we do what we do in the Municipal Engagement Initiative? I encourage you all to go to housingpolitics.com and read about this great research report from the folks at BU, Catherine Einstein, David Glick, and Maxwell Palmer. They did a fabulous study on essentially who shows up to public meetings that are talking about housing. And what they found is comparing who shows up to these meetings with voters is that commenters were disproportionately white, male, older, and homeowners. And these trends persist across high and low cost cities. And essentially, the majority of those folks show up and speak in opposition of new housing production and new affordable housing. And it results in inadequate housing supply across the Commonwealth, and particularly in highly desirable neighborhoods where we need more affordability. So definitely check out that website. But knowing that that's what kind of drives housing production in our state, it will be no surprise, you guys have probably driven around your communities and seen signs like these before, you know, stop the Whopper, right size, we don't want this here, no thank you. It's unfortunate, but this is what is driving the conversation around affordable housing in many communities. And we want to see in our municipal engagement initiative more signs like this all over our community. Protect and expand affordable housing, because we know that community support can make or break housing development at the local level. We wanted to step in because we know so many communities don't have a strategy or a coalition to build that local support. It takes work to get to that level, and that's where we come in through the municipal engagement initiative. So our strategy at the local level is to really support the efforts of each community. We want to create a culture that welcomes housing, especially affordable housing, as opposed to saying no. We want to bolster your efforts that you're already working on, and we want to grow the number of people, your Rolodex or your Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is, your contact list of people who are going to come out and support housing production in your community. So to do this, I will give you a very brief overview of how we do this work, but I would encourage you to check out our MEI Lite toolkit on our website, where you can see all kinds of sample agendas and stakeholder lists and coalition building activities that you can do locally. But really what we do is we identify a core group of folks who are interested in creating a local coalition. We help them to identify partners, a really broad list of stakeholders. We think about our work as really going beyond the usual suspects. We want it to be an umbrella organization with folks from all different areas of your community, because we see housing as so core to everything, right? Housing is related to small business development, and housing is related to mobility access, and housing is related to sustainability. So we bring in all of those various voices and we start having conversations. We do a strong data dive to make sure we are all coming from the same place and we have a good understanding of what's happening. And we have these launch events and meetings and really just start to grow a coalition from there. And we start, you know, with the communities that we're working in, we help them through thinking through the process, thinking through their mission statement, thinking through the actions they want to take, and how they want to grow. So it's been very exciting. We're in a lot of different communities throughout the Commonwealth, and are excited to work with them. That being said, it's a lot of work to do these coalitions and get them off the ground. And so I get asked all the time, what can I do in the meantime? If I'm not there, I'm not ready to start a local coalition. So I would ask all of you to do a couple of these things, or all of these things if you can, to dig into your local housing data. We are big fans of the MHP's Data Town. You can go on there and see data about your own community. You can also compare it to other communities and see where you stand on things like housing costs and housing production. Definitely meet with your local planners and elected officials to better understand the climate for housing in your community and understand where they're coming from, what challenges they hear, what strategies they want to pursue. Show up to public meetings. This is number one on my list of things that you should be doing, and speak up for more housing and more affordability. If we know from the research and from our experience that people who don't want housing and affordability will show up to community meetings and public meetings and forums, then we have to counter that and get people out in force, saying we do want housing, we do want affordability, we do want these kinds of strategies here. I would ask you to push back against myths and exclusionary language and concerns. So if you hear in a community meeting, you know, we don't want housing, or we don't want family-sized housing here because we don't want more students in our schools, you know, to push back against that and say we have room for more students, and actually that's a fair housing violation. We know we can grow and we can do it responsibly, and we have the space for people. There's always space to do an educational forum in your community about what you're doing and what you hope to do. And then lastly, I would say to really listen to people with the deepest affordability concerns in your community, the people who need the housing that we are advocating for being built. Really make sure that their voices are heard, that you're elevating their voices however you can, and supporting their voices in your local narrative. So I will pause there to hand it off to, I believe Paul Matthews is here. from the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. If Paul could unmute himself. We're really lucky to have an extra little presentation here in our Worcester and Central Mass presentation. Paul has some great research that he can share you. So I will hand it over to Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Dana. And I want to add how much I appreciate being invited to present with the other presenters today, not just yourself, but Central Mass Housing Alliance, RCAP, and New View Communities. And I very much appreciate CHAPA's work. I'm going to date myself here. In a prior capacity, I worked with CHAPA on the Home at Last campaign, which was about 2004. So I don't usually bring up 2004 in casual conversation, but CHAPA's been doing tremendous work for a very long time. And this forum's a great example. What I thought might be helpful is just sharing a recap of a home ownership report that the Research Bureau just issued a short while ago. So one of the things I should probably add, which is not sort of in my prepared comments, is Dana did a terrific job outlining voting patterns and how it impacts sometimes municipal policy discussions, particularly on housing. While I wasn't prepared to discuss this, the Bureau actually did a report right before the pandemic called Absent Voters that analyzed municipal election turnout in Worcester for the last several cycles. When I'm done, I'll put some links in the chat so people can check it out, but that conclusively shows that Worcester municipal elections are disproportionately dominated by, as you said, Dana, it uses data to show older white homeowners in certain of high income and high educational affluence in certain sections of the city. While it comes as sort of no surprise to anyone working in electoral politics, the data itself demonstrates that. Those aren't just assertions, those are data-driven findings. So I'll drop that in the chat, but that's sort of a bonus. It's an example of the fact the Bureau, the Research Bureau is 36 years old, so we're heading into middle age. I've been the executive director for almost 2 years now. Much of it's been dominated by the pandemic, but the Bureau itself is an independent nonprofit that does objective, nonpartisan policy research on a wide variety of topics. So everything from voting patterns in Worcester to education to home ownership to broadband, to transit, and economic development. So we're generalists, not specialists, but we try to use a data-driven approach to educate the public and policymakers and further inform ongoing discussions. So as part of that, we did this report entitled Achieving the American Dream, Disparities in Home Ownership, and we used Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data in combination with US Census Bureau data to really go deep on Worcester in particular, but we do have some contextual points about surrounding communities, though it is dominated by Worcester. So the next slide shows examinations of, and those of you from Worcester, I'm sure this comes as no shock, right? This shows median household income and education as it's spread out across the city by census tract. So not shockingly, the top 10 census tracts by income have homeowner populations that are 90% white. That compares to the bottom income 10 census tracts that are 65% white as homeowners. So that number is quite glaring. Now, the renting population is a little more diverse. Renters, the top 10 census tracts by income are about 83%. White, the bottom 10% is 64. So the gap narrows on renting, but it's quite stark on home ownership. Education levels show similar patterns. The top 10 census tracts have about 50% of the households have a bachelor's degree or higher. In the bottom 10%, in the bottom 10 census tracts by income, that rate is 18%. So it's a 50% to 18% swing. So again, we all know these things intuitively, but this shows conclusively using census level data that those are true. The next slide paints an interesting picture about Worcester's housing supply. So Worcester has more than 78,000 housing units, according to the Census Bureau. What's interesting is if you look at the year the head of household moved into the housing, 2010 is a clear benchmark. 43% moved in before 2010. 57% moved in after 2010. So again, that reinforces the perception that there's been a lot of movement into Worcester housing, and this conclusively demonstrates that's absolutely true. I grew up in Worcester, still live here. I frankly was a little surprised 2010 was such a benchmark. I thought it was going to be earlier. Of those units, nearly 72,000 are classified as occupied. Worcester has a vacancy rate of 8.6 compared to the state rate of 9.4. The homeowner vacancy rate is only 1.6. The rental vacancy rate is 3.4%. And of the owner-occupied units in Worcester, 68% have a mortgage, 32% do not. And I suspect if we were able to map that, which we did not do, I suspect it would map out against the income and education mapping we showed you earlier. The next slide is a comparison of the race of owner-occupied housing units compared to renter-occupied. So on the left is owner-occupied, on the right is renter-occupied. We use the same scale, showing, and we used white ownership or white renters as the benchmark. It shows the overwhelming differences across the city between owning and renting when viewed through a race and ethnicity lens. It's literally an inversion of itself, and the inequities are clear across Worcester's geography. So this is really important as we think about some of these issues relative to Worcester, particularly when you look at the impact of ownership and rent, which is the next slide. You can see here that we look at gross rent as a percentage of household income. And I know everyone on this call, particularly the folks from CHAPA, know that 35% of income is the rule of thumb about acceptable housing costs. So for renters, 44% of renters pay more than 35% of their income, and only 21% pay less than 20%. And if you look at owners, in Worcester, around 25% of homeowners pay 35% or more in income, while 40% pay less than 20% of their income. And that has a massive impact, not only on monthly costs, but on long-term fiscal assets for families. So when you couple this with the racial analysis, it shows the equity aspect of this cuts across almost every category. It's not just an issue of equity for equity's sake, but also financial equity. It's a huge contributor on a monthly basis, but also has a huge impact on the generational transfer of wealth and families' ability to do so, to finance whether it be college education or the next generation in a wide variety of needs. Next slide shows the percentage of mortgages to white homeowners in Worcester. So white applicants in Worcester are approved and granted mortgages at higher rates. So for instance, in 2019, the data we looked at, there were 4,000 mortgage actions taken for white applicants. 59% were approved, 18% were denied. There were 1,400 non-white applications. So compare that 4,000 versus 1,400, even with that vastly reduced number, which raises questions by itself, 49% were approved, sort of 10% rate difference from white applicants, and 23% were denied. Some applications don't know race or ethnicity, so that data was unavailable. We did look at the next slide at how some of Worcester's housing characteristics look at some of the larger central Mass communities that we use as typical comparisons. So we tried to look at Marlborough. We're not picking at anyone here from those communities, but they're the larger urbanized communities in the region. So Marlborough, Framingham, Fitchburg, and Leominster. So when we looked, note that Worcester is the only community where owner-occupied is lower than renter-occupied. So that's the circle in the first category. And then when we looked at owner-occupied unit value, you'll note that Worcester is only above Fitchburg in that category. And then lastly, when we look at median gross rent, Worcester is in the middle. $1,095 is the median rent. So this raises some interesting perspective on Worcester vis-a-vis other urbanized communities. I would suggest that owner-occupied unit value, seemingly it's dominated by proximity to Boston, like the further seemingly the further you are, the lower the property value. It could be argued based on comparison to the others. And the next slide, we try to take a step back and show Worcester against the surrounding communities and region as a whole about the race of owner-occupied units, showing the percentage of white occupied units. So home ownership patterns have long-lasting impacts, and we recognize that correcting all these imbalances would be a massive undertaking, and it's enormously complex. That being said, we think that this analysis helps illustrate some of the aspects of equity and some of the realities at work in Worcester and surrounding communities. So we hope that it's helpful to policymakers on the local, regional, and state level, the private sector, and community organizations like CHAPA, and all of you today. I really appreciate that CHAPA can be in this discussion, and there's plenty more information available. So my final slide shows the fact that this was a collaboration. So the Bureau did our own report on this, but we did so in a coordinated fashion with the Worcester Business Journal. So the Worcester Business Journal, in their May 24th edition, has two significant, the two largest stories in that edition are on related topics. They had access to our report beforehand, aligned and coordinated their coverage. So these are two infographics that I think demonstrate some of the value of the work they did in a corresponding fashion. We have here the worst neighborhoods in Central Mass for mortgage approvals. There's 20 neighborhoods, 9 are in Worcester. Some of them surprised me, frankly. But I'm going to put some links in the chat. If you're interested in further information, I'd suggest, number one, downloading our full report, which does have some accompanying analysis that I wasn't able to share in this type of a format. I'd also suggest, and I'll put a link in the chat, checking out the coordinated coverage with Worcester Business Journal, because they did do a great job looking in depth in some of these pieces as well. I also included on this slide a link to Worcester has a report available through its city website that was done by Central Mass Regional Planning Commission with some consultants that has some very interesting parallel insights into the city's housing market. So there is further data available, but I really want to thank CHAPA and thank all of you, because these issues are tremendously important. They're tremendously complex, and they really need sustained effort and attention by a wide variety of actors, including just general members of the public and community-based organizations. But thank you for the opportunity to present data. I can't promise I can answer every question. I learned a long time ago, never overpromise that. I'm happy to do what I can in response to questions.
That's good to never overpromise. I appreciate that. I'm sure you can answer many questions. I don't see any in the chat yet, although I will pause and see if anyone has questions and wants to raise their hand. But in the meantime, maybe we'll move on to, we do have Abinia Curvey is going to be joining us again. We'll go back to our state legislative priorities, but why don't we move on to hearing from our regional co-sponsors, which I think will be a great segue after your presentation, Paul. Really, thank you so much for all of that information. And like I said, we will be sharing this presentation and the slides. So if folks want to dig into the data a little bit deeper, and if you can share all those links in the chat, I really do appreciate it. Oh, we do have a question. Karen, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question about the owner-occupied?
Sure, it's nice to and the comment I've made anyway. This is a drum that I've been beating several years with the CHAPA regional conversation. And I really enjoyed your oversight, Paul. For those of us that are in first-time home buyer education programs, as well as assisting some of the families that are making application on mortgages, I want to direct really one very specific concern I've got that I don't necessarily believe is changing, but I hope I'm wrong. And that is when you mentioned the number of mortgages for owner-occupied versus rental-occupied flats, such as the three-story flats, which Worcester County is full of, and the city of Worcester is as well. So what I'm trying to do is correlate from our best information, because we primarily.
Hi, Karen, you just accidentally unmuted yourself, it looks like.
Now someone shut me up. Anyway, so what happens is we're still trying to correlate the fact that we know, at least based on our information, of so-called landlords that own 3-deckers or owner occupied, that there are, the correlation I'm trying to connect with is those that have a mortgage will more readily rent because they have to pay that mortgage. And if they're owner occupied, they have a reason to become a landlord, versus that number where you said, I forget the percentage, I should have written it down, of owner occupied with no mortgage. And so to me, it relates. And that is because in the past, where people were interested in buying the 3-deckers and they were owner occupied, it was that white male, whatever, but many of them have passed on. And what we're learning and trying to lease up in Worcester directly is that if there is a widow or there is no family interest in being a landlord, then they're not interested in renting out the other 2 units. Does that make sense to you? To me, it's a big issue, because what I see happening with the budget numbers and everything that continues to be formulated with new money coming in, which is all very exciting, but we have a lease-up problem of affordable housing in Worcester. I am concerned that we are going to continue to build new units. They're coming in, we're seeing the newspapers. We know that they're coming in and putting in a lot of very big lofts, et cetera. But the owner occupied piece to me still deserves a lot more attention. And it also can contribute to a whole new grouping of families who are interested in having an income to support that mortgage and become landlords.
Let me simply, Karen, agree and note a couple things, right? Like, one is, I've been in this role for almost 2 years now, and if one thing has been driven clear to me, it's that sometimes data has its limits. And in this case, the data is not very clear on properties like that. And yes, if you look at Worcester's housing supply, a significant number are 3-deckers. The city report, which well, it's on the city site. It was done by Central Mass Regional Planning. I put that as my final link in the chat. It's very interesting because it does talk about the fact that some of the most affordable housing is also the housing with the least amount of capital investment, because it tends to be done by a landlord, whether it be a 3-decker or perhaps a rental property that they own, as opposed to a sophisticated property management company. And that raises some very interesting challenges that are not unique to Worcester, but are definitely pronounced here. I can speak anecdotally that I know some people who own 3-deckers who are now older and were more willing to rent the property when they were younger. You know, meaning, to your point about widows or retirees, that's the case. So you raise an interesting point. It both in, I just want to be clear that data's vulnerability, but also the fact that yes, it's an important part of Worcester's housing market that absolutely should be looked at.
Yeah, if I can just add one final point and I'll stop. And that is that because we do the inspections, this is where our data comes from. So when let's just say there's a 3-decker on a street and we notice that that landlord is no longer issuing a voucher, then we reach out and say, why are you not issuing a voucher? And this is coming almost like a groundswell from an owner that says, well, that was my husband's thing. All the vouchers are gone now and we don't want to reissue. So it's again, a very small, slim piece of it, but there is some data out there and I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Paul, so much. All right, so we're going to move on to our regional updates from our partners. And first, we're going to start with Leah Bradley from the Central Mass Housing Alliance. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I think, Leah, if you want, you can go ahead and share your screen. Thank you so
Great.
much.
So, and I just went, this is my first regional meeting. So I started at Central Mass Housing Alliance in September of last year, which is nothing like starting during COVID when the rental assistance starts and now our emergency housing vouchers. So it's been quite an experience over the last, oh gosh, I think it's 10 months now. So I wanted to show a slide just to build off of what Paul was saying, which I didn't intend to do on my comments, but I thought it might be timely to do that. And so let me, so one of the things that he had mentioned was around just the percentage of folks' income that they pay towards rental housing. And there was a report that was done several years ago, and it shows that when somebody pays more than 22% of their income, that more people experience homelessness after that point. And when you look at the 32%, it actually goes up pretty rapidly. So just thinking about that, in 32 and 35 is, it's really, pretty much the same thing. And so just really looking at that piece of it as well as to say, how many folks are really at risk of homelessness. And of course, during COVID, we've also seen that there are so many people that, we knew the new Out of Reach report has just been released for 2021, which shows that the gap is widening for the amount that folks need to earn in order to afford rental housing. And so more and more folks are paying more than the 35% of their income towards rent. And again, with COVID, what we saw, just like we've known for years with the Out of Reach report, is that there are so many people that are on the brink of having housing instability. And when COVID hit, unfortunately, we saw so many folks that were on that edge that really had some struggles. And one of the things I want to mention is that one of the strengths that we've seen through this, and one of the real successes is, and I know, Karen and I both do the rental assistance program, is it's truly prevented homelessness. And so the reducing the number of documents that folks need to submit, and also making it early so that you can access prevention earlier in the process, so you don't have to wait until the court process has started, has really made a huge impact on folks being able to stay in their units, which is really ideal for folks. Again, like we just mentioned, finding a new unit that's really within the price range that they can truly afford has been really, really difficult. So the other slide I just wanted to show on here is also just around the rental housing that's been built in Worcester. And so just showing that, if you look at the orange line here, these are the single family homes. And so those that are the lowest income are typically renters, as we had said, and they're also disproportionately people of color. So really just looking at the lack of units that have been developed over the last, probably over the last 20 years. And also just looking at that most of our housing stock in Worcester is over 80 years old. And so a lot of that housing stock is old and needs rehab and needs some of the things that Karen was just talking about to meet housing quality standards. And that could be some of the reason that folks are keeping them offline. And so I'm going to stop sharing for a minute and just talk a little bit, just so folks can see each other. Oh, that was the wrong one. So I just wanted to share a little bit more about some of the successes that we've seen especially over the last several months as well. So we've really, it just is, does Roxana want to ask a question before I move on?
Sure, Roxana, do you have a question on that data that Leah was just showing? Your hand is raised.
No, I just wanted to make a comment, so just let me know when I can do it.
Okay, great. We'll come to you in just a minute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Great. So we know that the biggest struggle that we've had is, as Karen just alluded to as well, is that folks just can't find units. So the number of units that are available is really difficult. So folks with vouchers, folks that are our lowest wage earners, really have a hard time finding units. And this isn't just Worcester. I'm talking about, Worcester County. The housing, that gap has really gotten a lot larger. So we've been working in collaboration with currently the city of Worcester, which we're hoping to expand to outside of the city limits, and also some landlord representatives to figure out with those owner occupied units, the ones that aren't renting, what are the barriers to that, and how can we use some of the CARE Act funds, the COVID funds, to really help to bring those back online. And so Karen, the data that you have would be great if we could see that data as well about what's keeping those offline, and if it is somebody who is, doesn't want to rent because of the property management issues, one of the ideas we throw out is can we offer property management for those folks? What are some of the creative things that we can do to bring some of those units online? And it's really been a great partnership to have representatives from, the landlord component to a lot of that. We wanted to make sure that they were feeling supported. And sometimes when a service provider is providing that service for a landlord, it just seems like we're the advocate for the client. So really wanted to make sure that we had someone that was really representing the landlord's needs and the landlord as well. So some of the things we've been doing to try to increase units. We know we need to do more. And so really what we've been looking for is, like the recommendation that we've heard about the 20% of the ARPA funds going into affordable housing. So one of the things we're doing, we're advocating for 20% of Worcester state and federal funds to go into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, we don't have Community Preservation Act funds or inclusionary zoning, which is typically how those are funded. So really trying to advocate to put as much dollars into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund to increase the housing stock for extremely low income folks. And again, I'll just repeat, we do a lot of work with homeless folks. It's also, our low wage earners. And so in order, I think it's $27.88 now you have to earn in order to afford a 2-bedroom in Worcester. And so it's really out of reach for a lot of folks. And so how do we create more housing for folks that are extremely low income? The other thing I'll share just around our homelessness experience our experience with homelessness over the last 9 months. What we've also found is that non-congregate housing, especially for homeless individuals, is much more effective. And so what that is what the DHCD has been helping to support is a hotel motel. So people have a closed door behind them. They have a private bathroom, they have a private room. And what that also does is allows folks to have that private space. They can be there during the day. They have a place where they can do a job search, where they have supports. And it's also a setting that a lot of our homeless individuals who are sleeping outside are choosing not to go into shelter, are choosing to go into a shelter of that type, and really be able to get the support services that they need to be connected to housing. So we've learned a lot of things through COVID, and we just don't want to take a step backwards. And so how do we keep this moving forward? It's really exciting that we have this once in a generation opportunity with all of these funds that are coming in. And so what are the things that are working well, and what do we need to continue? And how do we prevent homelessness? How do we make homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring? And then also increasing the housing stock for the lowest wage earners, because that's really what we're seeing. Worcester, the last I heard was 14% of affordable housing, but it's still not affordable for so many folks. And so really thinking about how do we create that how do we fill that gap for those individuals? So the other thing in North Central, so understanding that there isn't a low threshold shelter in the northern part of the county. So we are partnering with the North Central Community Foundation and to develop a strategy to be able to do a regional approach so that there are non-congregate options for folks to become homeless in those areas, so that we really can make sure that folks are getting connected and that homelessness is brief. So on that, I will open it up to questions or comments. I know Roxana had a comment.
Yes, thank you so much, Leah, for all of your work and your presentation, but most importantly, the work you all have been doing. And Roxana, yes, please go ahead and make a comment.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. I work at Catholic Charities in Milford, Massachusetts. The quantity of units for rent, they are so extremely low or so extremely high in price. Our community in Milford, the majority of people are undocumented. So it's so hard for them to find a place to live by themselves with a nice price, good price, or because they don't rent them because they are undocumented. Obviously, some people, they are don't rent to single mothers. For what reason? I don't know. They don't rent because they are people coming from the other country, and they are with their. It's very difficult to help the people there because we don't have a lot of tools to help them because the units are so low, or the people, I don't know if they don't want to rent or not, but the number of people undocumented and with needing housing are growing so rapidly that we try to help them with rental assistance, but just 1 month. It's because we don't have enough funding, but I think it's important that we pay attention to Milford and some towns around there because it's growing, the community is growing very fast. Some people they didn't count themselves in the census because they're afraid for a lot of ways. They don't talk, they don't say anything about the abuse in prices because they are afraid. So I believe that we can do something for them, but I don't know where to start because we're trying to help them, but it's so low the price, the unit, and so high the prices. Sometimes they charge $2,000 for 1 bedroom, or 2 bedroom, $3,000. So it's what?
Yeah.
So I don't know why it's so high, but it's incredible, and they are trying to survive. So difficult for them because they don't want to use services that sometimes we offer because they are afraid for immigration.
Yes.
And things like that. So it's a very difficult topic right there. So because we try to help the best we can, but they are very close to open their necessities.
Yeah.
Because
Thank you,
they're
Roxanne.
afraid. Mm-hmm.
And Roxana, I'll just and thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think one of the other things that we know we need to think about is as we've moved towards this electronic society where most of your applications, most of your processes are electronic, it's leaving out some populations, and the undocumented is one of those as well. And so, I know, DTA is still not open for applications. They're still having folks call and do it electronically. They can go to the office, but they have to call the workers. And so really just thinking about and highlighting for all of us to think about, what are the equity issues around that and who's not getting included in that when we're moving to this electronic version. I mean, there's seniors that are not accessing resources as undocumented, and there's many folks that really aren't getting access to the resources that are out there. So we really need to figure out a targeted outreach for those folks too.
Yeah, and I thank you again, Roxana, for raising that, and Leah for your response. I'd like to go to our next regional partner. Mark Dohan is joining us from New View Communities. Thanks, Mark, for being here.
Sure, thanks for having me. So thank you very much to CHAPA for all the work that you do, particularly at the policy level. And also thanks to the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. That report was really great and highlighted a lot of things that we're seeing on the ground. And so I just want to talk, I don't have any slides, but I do have 4 sort of points that I want to talk about. First, I would just want to talk a little bit about policy. Then I'll talk a little about the home ownership and some of the trends and things that we've seen. Talk about rental and development, and then just end with a couple of concerns. So on the policy side, again, I just really need to thank CHAPA. There are just so much money and changes and everything coming down the pike. And it's at a time like this that really appreciate the work of CHAPA and others that are looking at things at a statewide level that can help us figure out what are, where New View as a community development corporation can have the most impact to help us meet our objective of helping low and moderate income families. All the things that you're doing. So thank you very much for that. And it's been, I know everybody has felt this, but just through the whole pandemic, there's just been so many changes, one after the other. We've all felt them. And I think CHAPA's made it a little easier. So, so thanks for that. On home ownership, one of the things that we've seen is that prices are increasing out in North Central Mass faster than they are in Boston. And so we've had more and more people joining our homeownership classes, and a smaller percentage of them able to purchase a home. They're just getting priced out. The homes are just not available anymore. We're also, I know the state has been working on a homeownership program. New View is part of that. We've started our liabilities to assets program. we've been taking abandoned homes and selling them back to income eligible buyers. One of the things that we're doing, and this relates to some of the equity work that Whitney was talking about, is we've created a 7-year mortgage so that after 7 years, the person owns the property free and clear. And it's been a great partnership with, I see Liz Murphy here, but Fitchburg and Leominster, Clinton, Gardner, and Athol have all been working on it. And one of the things that we're seeing, going back to that original question about inventory, is that there just isn't nearly as much as we had thought there would be when we launched the program before COVID. So that's been one of the challenges for the program, is finding homes that are affordable enough that don't need too much work, so we can then put a reasonable amount of subsidy in and still be able to sell them to income eligible home buyers. On the rental side, I know everybody's seen this, but we also have just seen rents increasing faster than when we had anticipated. And an early sign of this was we completed a new development in the midst of COVID, right at the beginning, and it rented up the fastest of all the properties that we've ever done. So despite having only virtual views, it rented up faster than any other property that we've done. We're also seeing a trend, particularly among our homeless and formerly homeless families. Those are the families that have been most stressed out by COVID and are having the biggest issues. That's been a real strain on our property management and asset management team dealing with these issues. On the other hand, it's great that we have more people housed, but they have really suffered during this time. And hopefully, as the economy keeps opening up, there'll be more decompression there. The other thing I want to say on the rental side is that this is, like you guys have all seen, we're really seeing at the local level a real interest in housing, both as an economic development tool, recognizing that there's a need for housing, and that supporters are coming out and actually supporting the housing. So I would say typically our developments were very similar to what Dana described, where you'd have local neighbors come oppose whatever it is we were doing. And then, we'd get it through, use a 40B. And the last couple projects that we've done, we've really seen we've seen certainly neighbors coming out, but we've also just seen strong support from citywide coalitions. This has been in Athol and in Fitchburg. Just real strong support for housing, recognizing the need for affordable housing, not only from policymakers, but also from residents of the community. And I guess the last part, just ending on concerns. Certainly I don't think we have a crystal ball. We don't know what's going to happen with the foreclosures. They've been rising very slowly, but steadily. And we don't know what's going to happen with that. And we are very concerned about, as all the moratoria end and the forbearances end, what's going to happen on the foreclosure side. Certainly, we've also seen an increase in eviction diversion demand. And hopefully that this money will make a difference, that we won't see the types. We had hundreds of people come through our office during the Great Recession, and hopefully we will not see that this time for foreclosure like we did last time. So I think the money makes a difference. So thank you all very much. And again, just a special, I know it's stressful for everybody, but our staff have done a great job of just dealing with all the changes and helping to respond to the needs that people have.
Thank you, Mark. Amazing work, and it makes my heart very happy to hear you have supporters coming out in your community. So let's keep that up. And for our last regional partner, and then Abhi Curve is here from CHAPA, so we'll get to her in just a second to give us our legislative priorities. But we're going to go to Karen Kohler from our CAP Solutions. Thanks, Karen.
Well, what they all said. I can make this real easy. Leah, I love being the last person after all your data. That's great. I just want to underscore, we've already talked about, I don't have any fancy slides. That's not me. So I'm just going to talk and I'll try to keep it focused. But I'm glad you mentioned 40B, Mark, because that's been a concern of mine. And I think that early on in some of the presentations where I think that separation of communities that are willing to bring in affordable housing and those that aren't. That separation is still getting wider, especially in the smaller communities. We've talked a lot about cities today, but I want to remind you that one of the things that RCAP Solutions does probably a little bit more uniquely than everyone else is that we work in rural. And so when we talk about the much smaller communities, those are the ones that tend to be longer standing homeowner. They don't necessarily have a lot of rental, which then makes me be more concerned about what happens when they in fact do have a 40B requirement and they may not have formal planners. Someone mentioned city and community planners earlier. I just want to remind you that there are townships and villages throughout all of Worcester County that do not have paid professionals such as Worcester would have, or even the city of Fitchburg or Gardner. So that's where RCAP oftentimes steps in to assist the community to sort out. We offer technical assistance as small, I call them small little city planners that run around. But we will offer technical assistance if it's so needed. There's an initiative that I do want to just put on your radar. It's nothing that anyone here has talked about, but it is on the radar with the state advocacy, and it is about residential well water. So for those of you, when we're talking about first-time home buyer, especially in rural, so there's a cross connect here. So a municipality or a town that has its own safe drinking water is not on well water. There are a lot of small communities within all of Worcester County that are still dependent on well water within residential ownership. We are partnered now with the Worcester Health Foundation, and we are looking at major pilot program, which we've now piloted at least 3 smaller communities to assist. The legislative side to this is very, very important. And Jamie Eldridge is really, Senator Eldridge is really highlighting this in his platform. And that is that when you go, whether you're a first-time home buyer or not, when you go to purchase a home, you will have your inspections done. You'll have all of the criteria done to enter into a mortgage. Nobody asks to have well water tested. You have the right to ask, but it's not required to have well water tested. And what ends up happening is that people will buy a home at a good price if they don't know to hold the prior owner accountable to having well water updated or corrected. Then they are taking on what can sometimes be a $30,000 or $40,000 corrective action. And so, and this is unhealthy drinking water for families. So I bring this to you because no one's talking about it, but to me, we have crossed over into whether we're talking about foreclosure or we're talking about first-time home buyer, the advocacy for making sure that well water is tested if the house is dependent on well water or mobile home parks. This is an area that we don't talk about because it's underground. We talk about bridges, we're talking about highways. Nobody talks about the infrastructure underneath the ground until you have brown water and you don't understand why. So that's my message to you. I support everything Leah and all of you said, but there's a lot more out there that contributes to safe, healthy families purchasing a home, especially whether it's in foreclosure. But what does affordable mean when they get in there and then they find out it's going to cost them $30,000, $40,000 that they were not aware of, and now they have to figure out how they're going to pay for that in addition to whatever means they put in for a mortgage. So
thank you
that's all
so
I'm
much,
saying.
Karen. I know that's a really important point, and thank you for raising it. We talk about safe, affordable, and accessible homes, and it cannot be safe and affordable without addressing that issue. So thank you for all of your work at RCAP and your comments today. Really appreciate it. I want to thank folks for all the comments that are coming in the chat. We have a really full agenda today. We've had such wonderful comments, and Abby Curvey has joined us from our policy team. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and she can talk to us about some of the state legislative priorities and changes that we've seen.
Thank you, Dana, and thank you everyone for joining in. I'm sorry I had to jump off from another meeting, so I'm a little bit late. But just to quickly go over some updates, just to review, I don't know if this was discussed before, but we had a really cool zoning legislation that went on earlier this year, which included housing choice, bringing down the from supermajority to simple majority for many zoning ordinances. And we are really excited to see how this plays out in many communities, because it can be really a good tool for smart growth and development, especially around transit, and just overall opening up the barriers for allowing more housing production in communities. So I'm just going to quickly run through, because I know we are a little short on time. We have a lot of information on what exactly the zoning reforms were. I just want to, next slide, Dana. I just want to focus on the three major things that this law did. It basically made changes to the state's zoning law, Chapter 40A. Through the Economic Development Bill, it, as I said, reduced the voting threshold from supermajority to a simple majority for many zoning ordinances, specifically smart growth zoning ordinances. It added a multifamily zoning requirement for MBTA municipalities, and also made changes to streamline permitting and address the abutter appeals reforms, which was definitely something that we were hearing from a lot of communities, where only a few neighbors could stop major developments by abutter appeals. So we are really glad that these changes have happened, and DHCD is going to be showing a lot of guidelines, and they are taking input. So we are looking forward to hearing from them to get to the details of the full law. I'm just going to swiftly run this through. This is just mostly for deeper information. If you are interested in this, I'm happy to touch base on this. We also have a lot of more resources where you can get into for more information on what the housing choice and zoning reforms exactly do. So I'm just going to quickly skim through this and get on to our legislative and budget priorities, which is right now happening on a very fast pace in the legislature. So please do reach out if you have any questions regarding zoning and MBTA. Can you get onto the priority slide, Dana? Thank you. So, sorry, I'm just trying to get my screen organized. So there's a lot going on. We had a budget that moved through the House Senate Conference Committee and was signed by the governor. We are very happy to see that most of our housing, affordable housing priorities were given an increased allocation, and the governor also approved that. So we are really happy about that. The only thing I want to talk about is the MRVP, the state's rental voucher program, which had a lot of money left over, almost 20 million left over from the last year. And our efforts have been to make sure that that money is spent, that we are, as much as getting allocated, that we are spending all of that money, and in terms of putting out new vouchers, and also making some policy changes to reduce the rent burden on participants of the voucher program as well. And so those are ongoing efforts. We also have a bill to strengthen the MRVP program and make it codified into the statute. That is something we are working on. Just a quick note, and that is something that we are hearing fresh off the press, that there may be veto overrides, because there was only one of CHAPA priorities that was vetoed, but still we are hearing that the legislature might take up veto overrides as soon as this week or the next. They have until the end of the year to take that up. So please be on the lookout for any action alerts that we may put out in terms of getting in touch with your legislators for veto overrides. On the legislative side, we are starting to see hearings come up for many of our priorities. The Housing Committee is starting to put out hearing dates, and we have a hearing for our housing production bill next Wednesday. I'm happy to provide a link where you can sign up and testify in support, or even provide a written testimony if you're not able to testify next Wednesday. So this bill is basically building up on the housing choice reforms and just expanding some of the things like MBTA, multifamily housing around public transportation by right instead of simple majority. And so just expanding what we are trying to do in terms of building those policies that will allow more housing production, doing ADUs by right. We are seeing many communities adopt that, and so it would be great if we are doing that on a statewide level. I already talked about codifying MRVP. We really want to strengthen that program and establish that in statute instead of trying to amend it every budget cycle. Also in terms of making sure that tenants are protected, and we are helping address the eviction crisis. Right to counsel would give full legal representation for residents with low income facing eviction. And so these are some of the priorities that we have been working on, and we'll definitely have more updates with the hearings and other things that are coming up in this session. Public housing, definitely a huge source of affordable housing for many households. This bill aims at creating more resources because our public housing stock is so old. It needs a lot of improvements, and we need to leverage as many resources to ensure that we have the funding for that. And we are really happy to see that through the federal funds, that is something that we can do through that as well. And also creating more revenue for affordable housing beyond the federal funds, an ongoing revenue. We heard from many communities that there is dire need for this revenue in order to make affordable housing development really possible, and expanding that, we need more resources. And so things like the HERO Coalition bill, which aims at increasing deeds excise on buying and selling of properties to raise revenue, is something that we are looking at, and that is something we're advocating, and really hope that we will get that through this session. Just a quick note, we have a new chairs on the housing committee. And so if you have not yet reached out, please do. They're really open and responsive, and it would be really helpful for them to hear your perspectives from different communities and regions. And it would be very helpful if you're able to reach out, because it's a big change in terms of the legislative direction when there are new chairs. And so we are excited that both of the chairs are they are knowledgeable and are listening to a lot of constituents and groups in terms of what are the housing needs. And so this is our chance to get our information out to them. And so I appeal all of you to reach out to them as housing committee chairs to just share your experiences. In terms of our work ahead, has Ryan already covered?
Ryan's already gone. Thank you, Avis. Thank you so much for jumping into this. To say it has been a busy week at the State House, at the state level, is a gross understatement. So really appreciate you making time for this. And that's it for our formal presentation. We've got about 10 minutes left in today's session. So I know there's been a lot of comments coming in through the chat, but I want to open it up now to all of you to, if folks want to either raise your virtual hand or raise your real hand, and we can call on you. We'd love to hear from you what you're experiencing locally, or if you've put a comment in the chat already and want to illuminate or elaborate on it, we would welcome you to do that now as well. Quiet, and that's okay. I did want to read just a couple of comments. Maybe I'll just go back through for folks who called us in on the phone. Trish Settles had to leave, but she did want to make sure to reiterate Karen's point about making sure we don't forget rural community housing challenges in these conversations. I think that's really important to elevate, especially in Central Mass and some of our other regional areas. Kevin had shared a couple of comments about union work, unions and safety of work in the affordable housing development world. And so I thank you for sharing those comments, Kevin. And then there had been a question in the chat about the wait list for vouchers, and I think Atel answered that in the chat. But Atel, could you tell folks a little bit more about the process that or Leah maybe about the process for vouchers as we move forward?
So that's a difficult question since it's evolving every day. We get more and more notifications on it every day. So what we do know right now is that so first the housing authority does have to notify folks on their wait list. And so any of that, so DHCD has to do that as well as the housing authority. So that's part of the regulations. So part of the emergency housing vouchers is that they need to go through the coordinated entry process. So the coordinated entry process is through the continuum of care for those that aren't aware of that. These are specifically for people experiencing homelessness or those at risk of homelessness. The coordinated entry processes for each continuum were set up so that there's a scoring or there's some way to identify those that are most in need. And so each continuum has its own way of doing that. And so essentially it was set up so that, and there was a recognition, I think in 2015, 2016, that folks that were most in need weren't always getting the resource because they were harder to have their needs met while they were in housing. So there were folks that had less needs that were getting housing programs, housing vouchers, all of those before other, actually instead of other folks. So with these, the other thing that that HUD is requiring for us is that we do a community needs assessment or some listening sessions, that we look at our data and that we target them to specific subpopulations with an eye towards those that have been most impacted by COVID, and also from an equity lens. So we are currently in the process of doing that. Right now, DHCD is planning on taking a portion of their vouchers and specifically applying those to those in the EA and the home-based system, and then allocating the remainder for the balance of the state. Right now it looks like we're probably going to get probably between like 30 and 40 for Worcester County through the balance of state, and we have 73 through Worcester Housing Authority. So it'll be probably about 110 we're looking at. Just across the region. And again, those that are in EA shelters or those that are in the home-based program that are EA eligible, there's going to be a separate process for them. And the state is actually allocating a large portion, which is great for those that are stuck in those units. So we're still going through that process. And so we will, we have some, and I should also mention, one of the recommendations from HUD is for us to use some of these vouchers for those that are currently in permanent supportive housing, because there's a multiplier effect to that. So if we use these for folks that no longer need services that are stable, first of all, they can lease in place, and we open up vouchers that have really intensive supportive services that are really designed for those most in need. So there's a multiplier effect. So we're looking at most likely starting off with prioritizing those folks, which again frees up some of the other slots for that have really intensive supportive services attached. Just to keep in mind, these vouchers need to go to the highest, those most in need, and they do not have supportive services attached to them. So there's no service dollars that are attached to them. So we're working with the City of Worcester, we're working with North Central Community Foundation, we're working with HUD to figure out how we might be able to get folks supportive services so that we can support the landlord, support the tenant, and also the housing authorities and DHCD to make this as successful as it can be.
Thank you so much, Leah, for that answer. I see Kevin has his hand up, so go ahead, Kevin.
Great, thanks. I just wanted to be a little more clear. So I work for the union, but of course, I worked for CDC for 10 years, and I should disclose I'm a past CMHA employee as well. As a union, we represent all workers in the construction industry, not just union members. So we are very conscious of the fact that poor Black, undocumented workers are actively being exploited in construction. And so those of us that care about housing and affordable housing, we need to take responsibility for that because we're building it. And we shouldn't be only looking at the outcome of we've created 200 more units at 80% MRI. We should be looking at the fact that Latino and Black workers were exploited. People were driven down from New Hampshire to build this building as opposed to hiring Black and brown people from the neighborhood. So we need to have this conversation. It's a hard one, but it's an important one. I think those of us in Worcester, we saw that the wage theft rallies we held in Worcester 2 years ago for months, 40 plus workers had over $150,000 stolen from them by the contractors there. Those workers were all people of color. And so that's what's happening in the construction industry. And so as we advocate for affordable housing, we need to take responsibility as housing developers, as nonprofits, and as people for pushing for affordable housing. I was part of the CPA organizing in Worcester to try and get the Community Preservation Act passed here in our city, but there was an unwillingness within the group to include rules and guidelines around that that would address the fact that this was happening in construction. So as a part of the carpentry union, we would be very happy to be involved in advocating. And if there's one thing unions are good about is bringing a loud voice to public debate. But we'll only do that if there's going to be good construction in terms of affordable housing. And we need to find a way as a community of nonprofits and affordable housing seekers to do that. So I'll end there, and I'd love to talk with anybody else offline later. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, Kevin. I really appreciate you speaking more to your comments in the chat. So we are close to the end of our time, but I want to just pause one more second and see if anyone has any additional questions or comments. If not, I just want to remind folks that they should definitely feel free to reach out to any of the CHAPA staff who have spoken today or haven't with any questions, ways to get involved with our committees. You can find all of that on our website, and we will be following up, like I said, with the recording and the slides and all of the links that we shared today. So really very much appreciate all of you. Thank you once again to our co-sponsors for joining us, and we will see you all soon, hopefully. Have a great day.